Anyway,
Morning, Jack.
good morning. I'm going to just do a quick recap. Melissa, welcome.
Thank you.
Jason is the executive director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Alliance, and he's going to do an update on what's been going on with the Alliance and some regional transportation issues. But before Jason gets started, if we could go around the room and just briefly name, and if we're with an organization, or like myself, just retired. So I'm Anita Grazer, and just retired, not just, but retired. Anyway, David.
I'm David Burns. I'm a member of the Fidelis.
John Boylan, just retired.
No, but John, you're one of the co-chairs of the committee.
Jack Vega, Claude Charitable Foundation.
Melissa McKenna, CEO of the Dallas Regional Chamber of Commerce, and the reason that John Boylan retired.
Kevin LeBlanc, Town of Herndon Representative.
Keith Merlin, Washington Airport Staff Source.
I'm Brandon Ferris, Loudoun County Economic Development and First Vice President, Community for Dallas.
Very good.
And Scott York, Executive Director for the Committee for Dallas.
So Jason, the clicker is all yours.
Let's see if it works this time. Hey, it does. So I know, we've got first of all, I just want to say thank you to Scott and Anita for reaching out to me to talk about transportation issues. I love talking about transportation issues, as you're about to see. There's only 50 slides here, so, some of them we'll go through pretty quickly, but I wanted to just make sure to touch base on, both what Anita had asked about, but also give you an update on some of the things the Alliance has been working on, even beyond the scope of what Anita was talking about. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that. For those who are unfamiliar, this is sort of the Alliance in a nutshell. We've been around for more than 30 years. We're focused on transportation improvements that improve our quality of life and economic prosperity in the region. We're focused on key factors like funding, a regional express lanes network, improving connectivity in our community across the Potomac River, improving transit. And so that's why we go out and educate and advocate the public on transportation issues and policies in the region. So just to kind of give you a bigger picture view of our process, really the way we focus on is making sure we have adequate funding, prioritizing regionally significant projects. If we're reducing congestion and reducing the delays and the time it takes to get it from point A to point B, that's why you have more economic prosperity and a better quality of life in the region. So what is that regional perspective? So the first set of slides, and I'm just going to go through, come from the National Capital Region's Transportation Planning Board. They talk a little bit about transportation, writ large in the region. So one of the things when I think about transportation, you can't really separate it from the growth of the region. How many jobs, how many people are we expecting to get as a region? And if you look at the region as a whole, you can see right there, 23% increase in jobs, 19% increase in population. That's about 1 million new jobs and 1.3 million new people. For those of us in Northern Virginia, about 50% of the new households and 50% of the new jobs coming to the DC area, and that goes from Frederick County in Maryland to Charles County in Maryland to Prince William to Loudoun, are coming to Northern Virginia. So we are doing exceptionally well. And as you can see, we're getting a big increase in activity centers and jobs and population in the region. The other thing I just wanted to circle there, because land use always comes up when we talk about transportation, I do think it is important for people to keep in mind that 80% of the land use that's going to be on the ground in 2045 is already on the ground today. So when we talk about growth and change in the region, I think when you look at some of the numbers I'm about to show you, it'll make more sense when you put that in that context, right? So,
Jason, could you address air rights? So I know there are places around Northern Virginia down in Arlington where we actually have put buildings above roads. Is that something that you address? I don't recall NTA talking about air rights and what we could do to expand that land use in a sense.
Yeah. So, again, that would be in like the 20%, right? So any new development falls into that 20%. This is based on what they do is they go to all of the different, and I just want to be clear, this is what the COG region put forward, and they basically go to Fairfax County, what's your land use plan? Prince William County, Loudoun County, what's your land use plan? And say, based on that, that's how we create these types of forecasts and plans and things like that. So, to your point, if Fairfax County said, we want to, use air rights and build over the toll road, they would have to then go to, they would have to update their comprehensive plan, and then they would go back to COG and say, we've updated our plan, here's our new numbers based on this.
Yeah,
So
my point would just be that looks like we can't do anything more in a sense of, well, we could. Maybe there's other ways of getting there we haven't thought about or put into the planning process.
yeah, and I'm just saying, based on what the current plan is and the current land use plans and things like that, that's sort of where we are. And to be clear, I mean, that 20% is big, right? I mean, that's, millions of people. Like, it is a big number. But I do think when we talk about land use, a lot of times what happens is this, like, oh, well, we should just have better land use. And it's like, well, guys, that's a great idea, but short of tearing down people's homes or tearing down, buildings and redeveloping, which we do a lot of in this region, there's a limit to what you can do. And even if you did the most aggressive redevelopment in the region, because the numbers are so big, you probably wouldn't change too much. Like, the redevelopment's probably like 5%, right? So it's, just because the region's so big already the way that it is. In terms of that plan and what that growth and where we're putting that growth, I do think it's important. On the left there, you see over the last decade, we've had an increase in density in high capacity transit corridors. That's where most of our density has gone. And you can actually see by 2045, under the current plan, we are going to almost nearly double the density of people in high capacity transit corridors. So that's also, when you talk about land use, we are also currently in the mode of doing that as a part of our current plan. In terms of actual spending on transportation dollars, about 2/3 of our region's transportation dollars are going to be going towards funding our transit system. About 1/3 of our region's transportation dollars are going to be going to our...
2/3 transit, is this cog-wide?
Yes, this is the TPB COG data, Rob.
So, I understand, but what's the justification for 2/3 for transit? How did they come up with that?
If there's an elected official in the room who I don't know, wants to talk about that, I mean, I'm not. You asked what the justification is. I don't get to make those decisions,
So
but I'm just telling people what's happening.
They have just. Okay, I go to NBTC meetings, and back in August or July, the guy doing the update for NBTC said 11% of Northern Virginia presently uses transit.
So
okay.
I do want to get into, Rob, just so you know, before you got here, I do have like 50 slides. So I'm going to cycle through a bunch of these things so we can kind of go through. But just so you know, to those points, we'll get to some of that. So I just wanted to be clear so people see what they do is they actually take, it used to be called the Constrained Long Range Plan. It's fiscally constrained. What can you reasonably expect to build? It includes, you look at that transit operations number. The vast majority of that is Metro, the year-over-year operations costs, which if you think about it now, Metro right now, the annual operating budget is over $2 billion. And it goes up by, 5% every year, basically, no matter what we do. So, you can see where you could get to 93 pretty quickly in terms of, adding up all those operation costs and things like that. And that doesn't include all the other local transit systems. So anyway, I just wanted to be clear because I think a lot of times people don't quite realize where we are. The other part too I wanted to be clear as well is that these are like considered to be regional projects that require being included in our NPO plan. What does that get us? That gets us about a 19% capacity expansion in our transportation system, a 5% increase in roadway lane miles, and a 27% increase in high-capacity transit miles. That gets us a 39% increase in walk and bike trips, a 28% increase in transit trips, a 10% increase in single driving. We reduce the VMT or vehicle miles traveled by 3%, per capita, but VMT overall continues to go up. And so as a result, if you have a 20% increase in population and a 5% increase in lane miles, you get a 45% increase in congested lane miles in the AM peak and a 48% increase in daily vehicle hours of delay. In terms of actual trips within the region, what that sort of translates into is about 80% of the trips in our region in 2045 will be taken via automobile, 7% via transit, 15% walk and bike. If you break that down to different parts of the region, you can see if you're in the region's core, you get more walk and bike and transit trips. If you're out in the outer suburbs, which includes Loudoun County, you get more automobile trips and less transit trips. And then most of the trips in our region, because that's where most of the population is, are taken in the inner suburbs, Fairfax, Montgomery, Prince George's County. In terms of how does that impact jobs, economic access to opportunity, they look at a 45 AM peak, access to jobs via transit. You can see if we built no transit, that would go up by 15% in terms of access to jobs, but based on all that we are building, it actually ends up going closer to 34%. In terms of access to jobs via automobile, it goes up 1.2% compared to today, but you can see if we don't build what is currently in the plan, it actually goes down by about 10%. That map, if you don't build what we currently have planned, all the green on that map basically disappears and everything turns into red. One of the things that I think is, one of the things that I think is interesting, as you can see, is that there's a large red section there on the eastern part of the region. So there's two things at play, right? One of those is that if you look at the last update of the Visualize 2045 plan, you see that red section goes down pretty dramatically. That's because in that plan, they included construction of express lanes from I-270 all the way around the rest of the Beltway. So when they took that out and changed it to a study rather than construction, you saw a dramatic increase in lack of access to jobs within that part of the region. The other key part of that is the fact that because, as I mentioned before, Northern Virginia is continuing to grow by leaps and bounds compared to the rest of the region in a lot of ways, that as we get more and more jobs in our region, then it becomes fewer and fewer jobs that are accessible to the other parts of the region. So those are key facts. And then also just wanted to also point out, this comes from the State of the Commute Survey. And the bottom section there is the pre-pandemic one. It was 2019. But if you look at the top section there, that is the 2022 numbers. But I want to be clear what TPB did here, which I think sort of obfuscates some of the reality here, is that they took the telework numbers, took them out, and then reran the numbers so that all the numbers on the right side add up to 100. So if you have less than $60,000 in the region as a household, your primary commute mode, only about 20% of that is telework. So when you see that 74% number for drive alone, that's 74% of the remaining 80%. Whereas when you see on the 61% number for $180,000 or more teleworking as their primary commute mode, then that 77% is 77% of the remaining 39%, right? So those are two very different numbers. So I did want to, at least for the drive alone numbers with telework, I included those kind of there on the right. So you can see if you have an income of less than $60,000 in the region, about 61% drive alone is their primary commute mode. And as you see the incomes go up, the percentage of that continues to go down pretty dramatically. So in terms of the policy, so that's just the big regional overview, right? So I wanted to, I think it's important for people to have that perspective when we talk about what we're focused on, and just to kind of a sense of what we currently have in our plan and how people plan to move. But in terms of the actual policies, the first thing that Anita had asked me about was the Maryland project. For those of you who follow this project, we have a new governor in Maryland, who is still working out exactly what his position is going to be on the American Legion Bridge 270 project, but he has appointed Paul Wiedefeld as the new Secretary of Transportation. Officially, the plan would be to go to the Board of Public Works sometime in March or the spring. It's very possible that that's going to be pushed back. So, it's at this point, it's March already, right? There's nothing announced. And in fact, again, my understanding is the Moore administration is still working to provide what they want. So they are doing a progressive design build for this project. So what that means is that, Transurban, along with a big team, is completing the environmental work and the design work for this project. At the point at which the design work is done, Transurban will then go to the Maryland Board of Public Works and say, here's the design work, do you want to move forward with construction? Maryland can say, thank you so much, Transurban, here's your $150 million, thank you so much for these plans, here's a nice shelf that we will put them on to collect dust, we appreciate your hard work, goodbye. Right? That is, in theory, something they could possibly do. I think publicly and privately, Governor Moore has said that is not something he's interested in doing. But it is important to keep in mind that process, because Transurban is not going to show up at the Board of Public Works and say, here's your design process. By the way, now that you see the design, what do you think about this, Governor Moore? Right before you vote on this, right? They want him to have input on the design and what he wants to see, so that when they come to him and ask for his approval, he's likely to say yes, or more likely to say yes. So the problem is we're stuck at that step right now where we're trying to get from Governor Moore what he wants, what we can include in the design, what they can put forward, and then as a result, then they'll come back to the Board of Public Works. But they have to even get to what he wants, so that then they can incorporate into the design, so that they can then come up with what they're going to propose, right? So how does what he want different than what the last governor wanted? I would point out, and I've done so recently in the Washington Post, that I think the way that Governor Hogan actually ultimately ended up in this project is in line with many of the goals that Governor Moore has stated, right? This project is multimodal. When it was originally proposed, HOV and transit vehicles could not use the express lanes for free, or that was one of the options being considered. Now they can. There's $600 million of transit improvements going to Montgomery County that only comes about if you do this project in this way. Otherwise, those improvements all get scrapped. There is going to be a new bike and pedestrian connection between the Potomac and Heritage Trail and the C&O Canal. And in fact, MDOT had to fight the National Park Service to get that connection, because they didn't want them to connect into that. So, there's all of these different aspects of that. And they got federal environmental approval, from the Biden administration for this project. So they have shifted this project to essentially be what, in 2019, the Montgomery County Council, the Fredericks County Council, Prince George's County Council, they all got together and did a big press conference and had a big giant map and said, we want you to avoid the north side of the Beltway. We want you to go from the American Legion Bridge up to the ICC and then come around and then go around, and we need transit components, and this is what we need. And they've done all of that. So now the question is, what more can they do, right? So that's the big question. But I think based on where we are now, I actually think this project aligns very well with Governor Moore's stated goals.
Is it more an issue of financing then? Because Moore's objection seemed to have been more about financing.
So I'm gonna point out here to my next slide, which this is a direct quote from the chair of the Montgomery County Council on television. I've not been a favor of Governor Hogan's plan over the years, but it's no longer Governor Hogan's plan. What I look forward to doing is working with Governor Westmore to relieve traffic congestion, to rebuild the American Legion Bridge, and to have a holistic approach to moving people throughout our community. So I'm just being honest with you, I think a lot of it is political. It's that when it was the Democratic leadership in Montgomery County against the Republican governor, that, it was much easier to just say, this is bad and let's find a reason, right? And then now that Governor Moore is sort of taking over this project at the last minute, it's a question of suddenly they're all switching, going, you know what? This is kind of what we have actually been advocating for the last decade. Keith, you may have been there. There was a Fix 270 Now press conference with all of the Montgomery County and Frederick County local elected officials saying, we need to widen 270 and fix 270 and improve the American Legion Bridge. We need the Express Lanes project. They all advocated for that project until it was Governor Hogan that proposed it. And then suddenly it became a question of, well, if he's proposing it, then there must be something wrong with it, right? So, I mean, I think there are some people who have, to your point, philosophical differences in terms of, express lanes versus non-express lanes and things like that. I will say this, the express lanes network that TPB has studied and others have studied, you don't get a reliable trip just by expanding the highway without the express lanes. You will ultimately, through the growth of the region, fill those lanes right back up and you're going to be back in the same problem. The benefit of the express lanes is they're almost kind of like BRT lanes that people can pay and get other people in their cars to take, right? So rather than just being only for bus, which you can use them for transit and bus, you can use them for HOV, or people can pay, and sometimes people want to pay for a reliable trip. One of the things I always, tell people when I first started in this job is my office is in Tyson's. My daughter has a severe peanut allergy. And back in 2019, there was a shortage on EpiPen Juniors. And so we were calling around to pharmacies, trying to get an EpiPen for her. And I got a call back from a pharmacy in Alexandria. They closed at 6. It was 5:30. And they said, we have an EpiPen for you. If you can get here before 6, it's yours. Otherwise, we just have to give it to whoever shows up in the morning the next day. It's like we can't hold it for you, basically. It would have been physically impossible for me to get from Tyson's to Alexandria at 5:30 p.m. to pick up my daughter's life-saving medicine without the reliability of the express lanes. And I think that's part of the power of having that congestion managed, thinking, you know what, if I have to pay $20 to get, medicine for my daughter that one time, I'm happy to do that. If you have a kid if you're running late and you have a kid who's in daycare and it's a $50 fee to pick them up 1 minute after, at 6:01, that $20 toll suddenly doesn't look so bad, right? So, as I said, I think that there are times where it's not just a, Lexus lane or a higher income lane. I think they make a lot of sense from a regional mobility standpoint to have those, types of lanes. So sorry to get on my soapbox on those, but that's
I just had a question about what their plan is. So I heard 270. Does it still include American Legion Bridge and then coming around, including 270, but coming around the Beltway, or is it not all 495 up in Montgomery and PG?
Phase 1. So we are currently doing phase 1. So this is where it gets fun and confusing, right? Phase 1 is American Legion Bridge all the way up to Frederick County, Maryland on 270. So that's phase 1. But originally the project phase 1 was going to be American Legion Bridge to the ICC and then around to 95. So as a part
using
of
the ICC for some of the hot lanes.
So originally they were going to use the north side of the Beltway. But that was, again, another part of that community input. When they talked to the local community, they said the impacts are too great on the north side of the Beltway. We don't want this. So they shifted the project and shifted based on feedback to do phase 1 from American Legion Bridge to 270. The problem is they had already started the environmental process. So there is a procurement process that goes from the American Legion Bridge to Frederick County. There is an environmental process that goes from the American Legion Bridge to the ICC, and then there's a second part of that process that's getting rolled in to go from the ICC all the way up to Frederick County. So the procurement and the environmental aren't perfectly aligned because it started differently and has shifted over time. So that's why it gets kind of confusing.
I-370 when you say ICC.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So, and that's, they're still in the study process for that north part. And when they are doing the design, some of the design work and the concession, the ultimate concession will basically be from that, my understanding, from American Legion Bridge all the way up to Frederick County. So that's piece 1. In the long range plan, there are studies, and it's still a part of the study to consider the rest of the Beltway. And Virginia is doing the south side of the Beltway, and that goes over the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, which goes into Maryland. So that's a joint study. And there's a lot of different moving pieces there. But just wanted to be clear that in terms of this project, we're kind of in a holding pattern, waiting for that.
At least till this summer.
At least till this summer, and until the governor really, there needs to be more movement in terms of what he wants and what MDOT can provide and what Transurban can provide and what are the changes they're going to make. And basically, what I've heard, sort of, behind the scenes, is that, the idea is sort of delay, and then he can put his stamp on it and say, this is now, here's a little tweak here. This is now a Moore project, not a Hogan project. The end. So we'll see. We just have to see what that ends up being.
This is not Mark Ehrlich. Who is this?
Evan
Sorry.
Glass.
Evan Glass. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have been to, let's say, over 5,000 transportation, land use, and development meetings in the last 25 years, thanks to Dave Edwards, who got me into this. And the big concern I have with the CTB's, what are we saying, it's Transform 2045?
The CTB, it's
I'm sorry,
VTrans.
TPB.
Yes, Visualize 2045. Now they're in the process of Visualize
And
2050.
so a couple of weeks ago, I went to the Fairfax County Board's transportation meeting at which they unveiled some of the elements of the 2045 plan. And I don't know if you mentioned it before I got here, but they are using what's called a zero-based budgeting approach.
I'm getting there, Rob.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Virginia.
Rob, let us listen to his presentation and wait for Ian for
Then we
questions.
can-
That would be helpful.
So the Virginia General Assembly, as you mentioned, there were a few bills that we were following. Just starting at the bottom, the VRE dedicated funding. VRE is a rail system. It was competing for funding with bus systems across the state, and we have WMATA has its own set aside transit funding, but VRE didn't. And so the metrics system that we created to evaluate transit capital and operations funding is more geared towards bus service, not rail service that VRE provides. So we basically said, okay, what does VRE normally get out of the capital and operations budget from Virginia? Let's pull that out and make that their dedicated percentage. So it doesn't impact anything, but it does that before the next round, because in the next round of project and operations prioritization, they would have seen a market decrease in funding because, again, rail systems right now, especially commuter rail, are seeing much less return or quick return than, say, bus systems across the region. So we were able to get that pulled out because that's critical to the viability of VRE. VRE would have been in big trouble without that funding. So we did get that legislative change, and we supported. That was a VRE and VTC bill that we supported. There was also a governor's bill from Governor Youngkin, the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund. This fund already exists. It doesn't have any money. And this fund could be used to fund transportation projects that directly supported economic development. There was $100 million sitting in the Virginia Infrastructure Bank, not being used. So Governor Youngkin proposed shifting that over to this fund. And then he was going to take about, over the course of the 6-year program, $200 million. So the first 2 years would be the Infrastructure Bank, and then it's like $50 million a year to get up to $300 million for this. And part of the thinking behind this is there are projects now, especially some here in Northern Virginia, SBI, that are, have transportation components that are key to having them move forward. But the state didn't really have a mechanism to say, if you come here, we will do this transportation improvement. And the best example of this is if you look at what we promised Amazon. We promised Amazon, hey, if you come here, we'll do these transportation improvements. And then Amazon said, hey, we're coming. And then we turned around and we're like, okay, so how are we going to fund these transportation improvements? Because we have all of these different programs that are supposed to be prioritized based on the quality of your project. And then suddenly it's like, okay, well, we can't just base it on the scores now. Now we have to do the things we committed to doing, we said we would do. And then they went to NVTA and said, hey, you guys need to put some money to this. And they took some money from NVTA for some of the Amazon projects. They took money from the state transit funding. They took money from all over. And every time you come in and say, it's great that you set up this system, but we're just going to ignore it now and take the money because we need it for this important thing, you're undermining the whole purpose in which you set up that system to begin with. So all this does is it takes the money off the top. And so the impact is very minimal on every, other transportation thing. And basically they passed this legislation. It has oversight from the General Assembly and all those different pieces. But what they need is a budget to fund it. So the funding mechanisms are going to be coming through the budget process, which the General Assembly has not yet passed. So there's the $100 million. The Senate version of the budget has $200 million for this. The House version has the original $300 million. So then it just becomes a question of which version ultimately ends up, or do they split the baby and make it 250 or something like that? So,
to apply for it, it's a competitive process.
No. No. So the Secretary of Finance, or not Finance, sorry, the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Transportation have to recommend the project. If the project is less than $5 million, then they're able to kind of move forward with it more quickly. They just have to get the Commonwealth Transportation Board approval. If the project is, I think, over $35 million, and it's changed a little bit over time, so I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think 90% sure. If it's over $35 million, they have to go to the state MEI board and get approval on that before they can direct it. So there's
NEI board?
MEI. I forget what MEI stands for. We use it, but it's basically the same board that approves a lot of the different economic incentive packages and things like that, and it includes legislators from the House and the Senate. So but basically you have to get General Assembly approval for any bigger projects before you can dedicate funding to a project. So there's plenty of General Assembly oversight, and then even if it's less than that, they still have to report to the General Assembly within 30 days of any commitments that they're making for this. So there's still reporting oversights and all of that. It does impact other transportation funding, but I think even if they took $100 million out a year, which they were actually proposing more like $50 million, something like $11 million from Smart Scale and $11 million from the Commonwealth Mass Transit funding, which, again, if you start breaking down the waterfall of all those things, it's a pretty minimal amount in terms of what the funding is, and our funding is currently up above the projection for our current transportation fund. So. And then the last piece I just wanted to mention too was Smart Scale Round 5. They're going to be going through, there was a budget amendment to try to get a working group on that, but the current administration is already looking at how we can improve Smart Scale, and they've sort of started that process of trying to get feedback from local governments. But I'll come back to this one. Sorry, I think I put that in the wrong place. But the Smart Scale Round 5, there was $1.6 billion available. Northern Virginia is only receiving $115 million. That's only the district grant money. That's basically the minimal amount of money that we could receive through this process. They have two pots of money. One is money that goes to each district, and it's a set-aside percentage. And then there's the high priority project funding. That's competitive across the state. We're getting zero high priority project funding, $0 for Fairfax County. There's about $90 million in unspent high priority project funding and $9 million in unspent NOVA district grant funding. So that's the funding that's dedicated to here. The next highest projects, there's a Route 7 improvements between 123 and I-495 in Tysons is the next high priority project funding that could get funded. And then the next district program fund that could get funded was the Route 294 corridor improvements in Prince William County. That's $22 million. So I would say of the $99 million that is being unspent that could go to Northern Virginia, I think we should at least get funding for those two projects. I think there's a bigger issue when you look at Smart Scale, the last few rounds, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but these are all of the current staff recommended funding projects, but you can just see from some of the names There's a lot of trails extensions, shared use paths, roundabouts. You can look at the cost there and see in terms of transportation project cost, the way that Smart Scale works really depresses the benefits of projects, especially even though congestion is supposed to be the number one thing. All the congestion benefit of many of these projects is extraordinarily small. And so, again, you're really comparing apples to oranges when you compare something like this to some of these projects to other projects. I think there's a big opportunity to reevaluate how we're the metrics for things, to really focus on moving people, right? I feel like if you're going to say to people, what is the fundamental purpose of transportation? It should be about moving people, right? That's if we are investing in something, we should be looking at what is the cost benefit of the people that we're moving, right? And so I think making sure that that's our primary focus. Again, not to say anything about these individual projects, but that would be where I think we should be focused on. The other thing I wanted to just touch on, and I had this here too, because I know it often comes up, it's just that this is the current budget outlook for WMATA. As you can see here, and this is they have the yellow line, which is if 100% of ridership were restored today, this is where they would be funding wise. Green is the federal relief money that they're getting, but ultimately the red number, the red part there is where the actual funding gap with 75% recovery. So in FY25, between $740 and $530 million basically is going to be the budget gap, and you can see it's only growing. And based on current ridership numbers, it's much more likely to be at the higher level, even though the ridership numbers are coming back. I think it was like before the pandemic, 64% of the revenue came during the peak period, which had higher ridership revenue. So even if you have the same number of people riding, but they're not riding during the peak, you're not getting as much ridership revenue return. At the same time, if you looked at Metro Rail overall for the last decade, despite 10% growth in our region, rail ridership was down, around 100,000 people a day. So, the issue is ridership is not going to keep pace with the 5% budget growth. You can see the blue line there is the budget growth, that they're projecting. That line keeps going up, kind of no matter what they seem to do. And so we're going to have those funding conversations. And the reason I put this near the General Assembly is because this year they didn't come and ask for money. But that's because the strategy is next year is going to be the Metro funding year. And ultimately it's going to be a question of raising taxes, raising some type of new generated revenue to keep Metro whole, tied to governance reforms, accountability reforms, all of those different things and improvements. And if we have, I'm working on this now. I don't have all the answers, but if you have thoughts or ideas, I'd be more than happy to hear them and talk about them in terms of what we should be looking for, what we should be focused on in terms of what to ask. Because if we wait until December or November to come up with what we think as a community our funding mechanism should look like and what our reforms should be, it's too late. The train's going to leave the station. January, things are going to start moving quickly, I think, on this. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. It wasn't a big issue this General Assembly, but it will definitely be for the next one.
So the WMATA budget meeting is next Wednesday, I think it's March 9th, in West Falls Church. I sent out, I've been asking for over a month. There was a Washington Post article in about January 12th that said that they would study the impact of the fare changes on the suburbs. And if you read a couple of days ago, I sent a reminder to Regina, who's the head of government relations, that one of the things that they have proposed in the present budget is to eliminate the present fare surcharge for the peak period. And I basically talked to Walter Alcorn on Sunday. Walter's the Fairfax County rep on the WMATA board, alternate member. And I said, this is ridiculous. because the whole reason you have the demand for a new tunnel under the river is because, and so what they're doing is by eliminating the peak period surcharge would actually accelerate the problem for the Roslyn Tunnel. And so what I said is that you should have a 50% increase. Let's say the max fare right now is $6, $9, and then use some of the revenue from Virginia, even if you don't do this in Maryland, D.C., use some of the additional revenue to offset the increase in jurisdictional subsidies, which is what you portrayed in that big red there. And so the Committee for Dulles needs to get a position on some of the, we have already borne a disproportionate share of the cost of the Silver Line because the inner jurisdictions, in contrast to the first 103 miles, and then what's going on in places like the Potomac Yard Station, which by the way is now 370 million, more than twice its original. In other words, we're helping fund the projects in Arlington and Alexandria. They have contributed $0.00 to our system expansion. And so something fundamental has to change. I think the present setup where they got rid of half of the board 3 years ago is ridiculous. They need to go back to a larger board so that Fairfax County has representation. And so as to the smart scale, you pointed out that proposed is only 8.5%, and what you showed is some of those projects are trails. And
Hey, Rob,
yes,
Let him finish.
he's our guest here to speak.
okay,
Do you have a
well, I
question
thought he
to
got to
make
the end of it.
question?
Go
No,
ahead.
he's not.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. And again, you and I talk on the phone all the time. We have these conversations, so I'm always happy to chat with you about it.
Well, I think people need to know
Yeah.
that the present legislators and supervisors have not yet tackled the WMATA problem.
They have not, and it's going to be a big problem that we're all going to have to be working on addressing. Absolutely. Transportation Planning Board, and Rob is also pointing this out as well. They're updating the long-range transportation plan. Back in 2021, we made an agreement that when they updated this plan, they do it every 4 years. They just finished the last plan last year. Normally they wait 2 years to start this process. They're starting it now. They're doing it from a zero-based budgeting approach, which basically means normally if your project was already in the long-range transportation plan, it would stay in the plan, and then you would have to vote to add in new projects. Now they're basically taking everything out, and everything has to kind of go back through a reevaluation. If your project has funding on it, that reevaluation is less, right? It's basically like if you're already in the process of building this, it's got funding, you're moving forward, we're not going to come back and try to stop that. But they basically have kind of a green list of those projects, and then projects that are not currently funded is on the orange list. And I think those are kind of going back through a deeper look at the project. They're they have that initial draft list now. They basically are viewing the next 3 or 4 months as the public comment period on those projects and the time to contact your legislators. I'm on the Citizens Advisory Committee, for this, for the TBB. But basically, the reason that we're doing all of this is because essentially it's an effort to try to pull projects out of the long-range plan, specifically mostly road projects. You can see the VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, a lot of it is really project-based as opposed to population-based. Even if we build nothing, vehicle miles traveled in this region is going to continue as we get more and more people. And in fact, they did a climate change mitigation study. And if you looked at VMT reduction strategies alone, you can see there that the current forecast is the gray line at the top. The light blue line and the dark blue line are what vehicle miles traveled would have to do per capita in order to use that as our key focus of meeting our climate change mitigation goals. And it's just frankly unachievable. It says right there, unachievable for the 80% goal by 2050. And then that climate change mitigation study also looked at different strategies and scenarios we can do to reduce emissions in the region, as well as combinations of those. The reason I have that box highlighted there is that is sort of the mode shift. That is, if you did mode shift VMT reduction to the max extent possible in the region. And that includes things like, free transit, reduced transit, more housing changes, telework of 40%, cordon pricing in DC, VMT fees, all of these things, some of which we may or may not ultimately end up doing. But if you did that to the max extent possible on the cleanest grid possible, you get about a 17% reduction in emissions compared to the baseline. That's nowhere near the 50% or 80% goals that we have set. Ultimately, as you can see, the clearest, most effective thing that we can do to reduce emissions in our region is encourage, electric vehicles. That in and of itself, if emissions is the primary goal and that's what you're trying to do, the primary focus of that should be vehicle charging stations. It should be, incentives for EV purchase, making it easier for people to do that. Those are the things, if emissions is your primary focus, those are the things that have the biggest effect, the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak. And so I think, as I was pointing out earlier in this, doing things like taking all the projects out, the stated goal is to have them reevaluated through an emissions lens, but ultimately the effectiveness of that is very questionable. Additionally, they did a study, if you took all the projects out, in the current baseline plan, you get about an 11% emissions reduction, just based on where we are today, based on what we plan to build. If you took out all the road projects, you get like a 14% emissions reduction instead of an 11%, so it's about a 3% difference. But you also get about a 40% increase in vehicle hours delay in the region. So, on top of the current baseline, which is about a 30 to 40% increase. So you get a pretty dramatic increase in terms of delays for the region. So I know I've probably said way too much and gone over way too many things. And so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We did a travel survey and a poll, and I'm happy to show people data if they were interested in that, but I do not want to keep talking unless you guys want me to keep talking, and I'm happy to be quiet now. So thank you for the opportunity, but that's all the policy issues, as you can see, that we're kind of working on at the moment.
Let's go around and everybody get a question. And as somebody at a recent talk said, please ask your question as a question, not a statement. Questions?
I do have one. And so a lot of the focus of what I do for Loudoun County is on manufacturing, logistics, aviation, things like that. And the electric vehicle conversation comes up pretty frequently. But the cost of electric vehicles will not allow us to reach that number. Yes, it's most effective, but cost won't be there. Has there been any discussions about proactive measurements that can be taken with the automotive industry and manufacturers to kind of encourage that price reduction and affordability for EVs?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's partly where, I think if you ask most people, they support what I think of as positive steps towards meeting our emissions goals. That's incentives or, reducing the cost of things like public transit or things like that are positive steps. And those are the types of things that I think ultimately are the direction that people are going to have to go in. I think the difference is when you look at it, you see many of what they look at as the mode shift things like, an extra VMT charge and a congestion pricing charge and all those things. I mean, I do a lot of work on trying to get express toll lanes passed. And I can tell you, despite the numerous benefits that you get from express toll lanes, we still face extraordinary opposition, right? Imagine if you went out to the public and said, hey guys, I know you're out here in Dulles and this is a suburban office park, but it's an activity center. We've got to price everything here, right? You can't just park here for free. Imagine what people would say. Imagine if they said on Route 28, they said, we're not going to add any new capacity. There's nothing new happening. We're just going to add a toll lane on here to try to reduce the amount that people are driving. We're going to take that money, and charge you that money, right? So I mean, I think you would see a wholesale revolt, right? Of people then like, well, we're just doing this because ultimately it's going to discourage you from driving, right? And so I think you bring up a great point, right? Which is cost. I mean, I've had the same experience just buying my own family vehicle. It's like, oh, maybe I'll, get an EV hybrid type vehicle. And then I looked at the cost for the same vehicle on just the regular hybrid versus the EV hybrid and said, yeah, I can't do that, So, I mean, I think there's a lot of those cost issues, as you said, that are definitely a big part of it. But, again, it's also about the value of what you want to do. And I don't see a world in which you get the emissions goals or targets that we are setting as a region without doing those things. I think one of the things the Virginia General Assembly did back in 2020 is peg the automobile, gas standards in Virginia to California. And as a part of that, they've made it so that by 2035, you're no longer going to be allowed to even sell gas vehicles.
Right.
So you can argue about, again, the impacts of those, the costs of those, all those things. But if emissions is your primary goal, ultimately you kind of have to do those types of things. So again, it's a question of, do you want to be the person who comes out and says, you know what, we're not going to meet our emissions goals, and that's not the end of the world because we're actually reducing emissions within our region, there's plenty of people who want to say that. I'm not getting into that battle. What I do think is important is that we balance our regional goals. And so from my perspective, saying we have to do whatever it takes to reduce emissions, and even if that means, increasing delay in our region by 40+% or whatever, and doing all of these other things, my concern is that that's just going to drive people out of the region.
Yeah.
It's going to create economic issues. People are just going to go somewhere else. And they're already doing that. That's what my other slides are about, is that they're already doing that. We're already losing population. We're already having those issues.
Yeah.
So, it's the classic, we were born on third base and we think we hit a triple, right? It's like people in the region can't possibly imagine that people wouldn't want to live here and pay our exorbitant housing costs and pay our exorbitant whatever costs, right? And guess what? They are the biggest growing places in the region are, Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, right? Those are the fastest growing places in the region because you can get
rural.
Yeah.
Some of the rural areas.
Yeah, I mean, you got to,
Some.
on the 84% of that, Jason, does that include the production of the electricity for the cars or just the cars?
So you can see here, and I tried not to get too complicated,
I got to leave in a couple of minutes.
But they've got the reference grid is like kind of the current grid. It's what we have currently have and kind of planned for based on what we are expecting. The modified grid is like, oh, it's a little bit cleaner than what we're expecting, and then clean grid is, completely green grid. So if you look at the first number, the 13% and the 16%, that's kind of like if we make no major changes in our electricity grid, just based on kind of what we are sort of already planning for. So what's legally already going to happen, but no major effort to change that. So as you can see, the first column is, as you can see, as it starts to naturally get cleaner, but that's why.
A tough one. I mean, it's the alternatives. Where was it? We were at one of your sessions and it said, laying down the goal to make it tough and then have technology catch up to the wish. The problem is,
We've seen that in the Air Force.
Yeah, can you do it? I mean, can it actually happen?
Will it actually
Yeah.
occur?
Will it be worth it?
I mean, the pain is that we can't get young people here. They can't afford to live. Transportation costs are extreme. People are moving out further. I'm glad there's not a lot of talk about the mileage tax, because all that does, that's such a regressive tax on people. It kill the people at Dulles that are working in the shops and everything else because they can't afford anywhere here. They're living an hour away. Well, Claude Moore, you live way up in Frederick because they don't pay you enough to live closer. I know, I've heard that, Jack. I mean, my God.
So
But I apologize.
Actually, Jason, as he's leaving, can we talk about the Potomac crossing? because how do we get from Frederick?
Yes.
I mean, you kind of shut that down at your breakfast over in Maryland.
Yes.
But we still need to know, so what are the thoughts and how do we start with
So
stuff using the way?
that's a great question, John. I'm happy to. I knew Potomac River crossing, right? So, and again, going back to the poll survey, and I know John and others have seen it, but we do have a survey showing strong support for building a new crossing. I've gone back, kind of offline and looked through, with some transportation professionals to say, realistically, what would something like that look like today? What could we do? What could we not do? Thank you. I would say, based on, Scott, you're recording this still? Yes. Okay. I would say, based on kind of where we are now, the likelihood that you're going to get an ICC connection, frankly, it's just feasibly would be so hard to do. You look at the environmental impacts, the protections that are built between here and the ICC and Route 28 and getting across there. I think that would be short of a major sea change. I mean, again, we're just talking about, can we even improve a roadway, or are we going to take all of those projects out, right? Like, that's what we're fighting for now, much less, building a new freeway. I don't see a world in which that part of it happens. What I think we should really be focused on is really making, again, that regional connection piece, something that has a much smaller footprint, something that looks much more like, say, a permanent, White's Ferry equivalent, right? I mean, for those of you that have to do that trip and go back and forth through White's Ferry, first of all, it's closed now. It's not, even when it's open, it doesn't run all the time. If you had a smaller bridge that has a bike and pedestrian component, you could end up in a world where you have people in Loudoun who can go enjoy the Ag Reserve in Montgomery County. You can make a smaller bridge that connects into the existing roadway here into River Road in Montgomery County. You could impact fewer properties. You could do it in a way where you only impact like a couple of properties. You could mitigate more of the environmental impacts, all those different things. But ultimately what you get is that extra connection. And for people like Jack and others, another way to get across that's not having to travel down Route 15.
You'd be looking like a 2-lane bridge, essentially.
For traffic, and then additional for bike and pedestrian connections.
Any preliminary studies been done?
No.
Okay, that's a quick answer.
No. But we're again, they've been studying that bridge for a long time. It's a question of feasibility. And so I'll tell you right now, right? The current executive in Montgomery County, doesn't want to do anything in this direction, right? So anything we do now is really about study, feasibility, talking and when I think about this, I think about what would it take to get Montgomery County on board, right? And I think anybody who comes in and says, oh, it's fine, we're just going to build, a brand new 4-lane parkway from, Loudoun County straight to the ICC, that is just, heads will just explode, right? But I do think that you can make the case, a very reasonable case, and one that should appeal to a lot of people, to say there's lots of people who go back and forth that this could be helpful for, that we could tie it into the existing roadway network, that we could work on improving some of the existing roadway network, but make a small footprint bridge that could help a lot of people, but do it in a way that is environmentally sensitive, that also gives people, I think could be a lot of demand and access that Montgomery County would benefit, and the tourism and community and the Ag Reserve would benefit from a connection to the C&O Canal, all the people who bike through the Ag Reserve. That imagine if you lived in Loudoun and you could, if you're a driver or a biker, you could get over to Poolsville, very quickly and back and forth. I think
Poolsville has been hurt with the White Ferry closing.
Yeah.
And the 2-laner, it's really aimed at the local markets.
Yeah.
Not intended to be an expressway.
Yeah.
It's not a regional.
It's not a regional. But I think, and here's why I think that this is important. Maybe you can stop recording now, Scott.
It's not the end of the program, Jason.
Okay. We can meeting adjourned. We'll talk about it offline.
Jason, has funding been restored for NVTA to get us back what was taken away in 2018?
We're still about $38 million a year short of that.
And in the budget negotiations that were going on,
the conversation around MBTA has dropped off pretty dramatically. I think it boils down to, a few things. Basically, the current makeup of the General Assembly is not inclined to do things in support of Northern Virginia. So, I think that that's a big piece of it. And then, I think that we are, it's just a question of we come back every year and ask for more and more funding. Eventually people say, like, we took care of that in the General Assembly. It's like, you got to give us time. Like, we just gave you more funding in 2020. We want some more time in between to show we have all these other funding needs. What are we going to do that ultimately ends up in Northern Virginia? So, I'm not saying that we shouldn't restore it. We absolutely should. But the question of how you do that, I think the momentum and the energy behind that has died down for now. And we got to figure out a bunch of these other pieces first before we come back to that conversation.
But I've been to 4 of the last 5 CTV meetings in Richmond.
Yeah.
And you would think that Northern Virginia is on another planet. Okay, nothing gets discussed about Northern Virginia. We have a General Assembly delegation that does nothing for us. And the governor, sadly, doesn't. I spent time on the phone with Richard Cummings, the Secretary of Finance, back in August, trying to get some of the toll increase that MWA instituted, including the $250 million overrun, to try and get some Commonwealth relief on that. I failed. I'm going to try again. Apparently the budget conferees are going to meet next week. I haven't given up. I keep trying on these things. But it seems, unfortunately, other than your group, the business community doesn't appear to have been vocal in supporting the more fair You mentioned about the smart scale getting 115 million out of 1.6. That's 8.5%. And even Mary Hines, with whom I rarely agree, said it was the lowest we've ever seen. Okay, and what was the response from our General Assembly delegation? Nothing. Crickets. Okay, and Saslaw's retiring. I don't know if Hal has changed her mind about retiring, but
I think she's announced her retirement. Yeah.
So all I'm saying is, I had gone to, I think her name is Janet Muldoon, who's Saslaw's legislative person. I said, look, while we are still here, can't we do something that gets a better fair share of the pie? Fairfax County, Brian Hill, the county executive, has for several years reported that we only get back 20 to 23% of the funds that we, businesses and homeowners, send to Richmond. We are not getting a fair shake of the dice.
No, it's not only that, we have to tax ourselves in order to get our projects done.
Yeah. Well, okay.
Okay, so just let me, just one last thing, and then we'll shut off the recording. My impression just sitting here, listening to this kind of confirms what I think has always been a problem in the region, and that is the political goals are never in line. They want all this land use stuff and all this economic development stuff to happen, but they don't want to put the transportation projects into place to serve the people that have to get to work, that have to get to school, who have to go to work and go pick up their kids, and et cetera. And it just seems like nobody's in touch with reality at the end of the day. And the transportation goals are so not in line or in reality to what is actually happening physically in our region.
I hear what you're saying, Scott. I have a slightly more optimistic view than that, to be honest with you, because, and maybe it's just because I'm a few decades younger than some of the folks in this room, and you guys have been around longer than I. You've seen a lot more of it than I have. But since I've been with the Alliance for almost 5 years now, right? And one of the things that I see, at least trying to look back historically, compared to where we have been. I think it's important to give credit to where we are now, to the people who have worked to get us there. It's always, and I mean, you've been one of those people, Scott, right? You know, it's like Loudon wouldn't have the Silver Line, you know, without you, right? So it's like, I know you've been in the trenches longer than I have on a lot of these issues, but I would point to something like NVTA and say, look, we taxed ourselves, we are investing in projects. Transportation projects inherently take a long time. Even when you have the funding, all the studies, all the pieces of funding you have to cobble together, all the different things that you need to do, I view from a positive side that I feel like Northern Virginia, at least as a region, is doing what it needs to do and has a vision and seems to be working together and moving in the right direction. My biggest concern, especially when we look at some of the regional stuff, is the fact that DC and Maryland look at everything happening in Northern Virginia and say, man, if they didn't spend all that money on the stuff that they want, they could be spending money on stuff that we want, right? And so they look at it and go like, man, if NVTA didn't spend on these, road projects out in Prince William and Loudoun and Fairfax counties, they could be spending all that money on Metro, and then we would have to pay less money for Metro, right? So I do think that, when we talk about the region as a whole, it's important to keep in mind, from my perspective, I think Northern Virginia leaders are doing a pretty balanced job. They're trying to balance the different, factors that we have in our region, and I hear often from, at least from legislators, and local elected officials in Northern Virginia, that they have not necessarily bought into, this effort to just be more like DC and be more like Maryland. So, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's important to keep in mind that some of those things are changing for people, and that it's not, to give credit where credit is due, right? And to say, we have done a lot of things on transportation, but it's only been a decade since NVTA was actually funded,
I won't disagree with, I think Northern Virginia has done a much better job, but we're not impacted just by Northern Virginia, which is part of the problem. But anyway, one last thing for.
Scott, can I sneak one in before you close it?
Go ahead, and I just got one announcement.
I was disappointed that I used decades plural and not just decade. I mean, drove it in there a little bit. But, and Jason, I'm a big fan, but you never said Dulles, right? You never had the airport in there. When I look at what happens down in Richmond year after year after year, it's all about the port.
Yeah.
Right? And port becomes really important. We don't take Dulles and put that same value of a port, not a seaport, an airport, and what we do for this region. And so what's important, and why this was good.
And what we do for the state as part of it.
Right.
Dulles.
But when we drive to these numbers, this was important for us to hear, although it didn't talk about the airport and what it does, what's the competition for those projects? How do we think forward in the future? The problem right now is, and again, we're committee for Dulles, that's why we're here. Everybody thinks we got ours because we got the Silver Line out there, right? All the benefits. But we need to be thinking about the modernization. We need to be thinking about the cargoes. We need to be thinking about 28 and 50 and what do we do to move people out. That's why those other places and the Potomac crossings are so important. That same vision we had and the hard work that Scott did when he was in those public, official positions are things we need to start setting in place right now. So we have the vision for Dulles going forward. But year over year, we need to be down in Richmond pushing for Dulles as well.
Absolutely.
Which means talking to our Northern Virginia delegation.
And I would add on that, and sorry not to keep going on for too long, but one of the reasons I bring up this issue, and especially the TPP issue, is because in order for your project to be qualified for federal environmental approvals and federal funding and anything like that, you have to be in this long-range plan, right? So like I look at, for example, one of the recent improvements that was added to this plan that they're trying to roll back, luckily we got some funding for it, but was the Route 50, it's like a collector road or something like that, right? That was a project that we had to fight to get in there because it was a new road project into this plan, right? So there are, and I was trying to be cognizant of time, but there are some projects that do affect Dulles. And I'm currently in the process of communicating with MWA about what their vision is for the toll road and what their vision is for the network around. but I try not to get out in front of certain experts and certain people. It's like I don't want to come out and be like, oh, here's this, Dulles project that's getting taken out, and then Emma's like, actually, we're not going to do that anyway, so it's fine, right? So I just so I am in the conversations. I've actually met with Bill set out yesterday morning. I've been talking with them about what are the transportation improvements around Dulles that we need to be focused on. And from my perspective, I think, Loudoun and Fairfax County really need to get on the same page on Route 50. That's a huge piece of it. I think we need the Route 28 bypass in Prince William County. I do think, and I know I actually don't think this is much of a Dulles thing, but I do think we need a better connection between Prince William and Loudoun. What's historically been the Bi-County Parkway, but some type of, improved Prince William Parkway extension, North Star extension, whatever you want to call it. But there should be the second and fourth largest counties in the Commonwealth of Virginia should have like a direct, non-old, country road that connects them, right? So however you want to do that, I'm all for it. So I think that is, where there are those things, and I'm sorry I didn't get to all of those different pieces because they are a part, I just wanted to be clear, they are a part of some of these things that we're trying to fight about. But if there are specific issues beyond the bigger regional issues that we can be helpful with, I'm always here to be helpful. I'm always here to be, a voice and to help and advocate. So please also, I like it to be a two-way street. I know I did a lot of talking today, but if you guys have things that you see and say, hey, this really needs to be a part of the regional picture, please tell me. And I'm happy to incorporate that.
Great.
Thank you.
And as time is kind of up, I just want to let folks know that the next meeting of the Legislative and Economic Development Committee will be April 11 at 7. We're going 7:30 to 9:30 at the Crown Plaza. It is a breakfast with United. They're coming out to share all things Dulles that they are working on and doing. So, and it is, and I'm sorry, members, there is a cost. It is $30 per member and $35 for those that are not members of the committee. So, and you may want to come to our luncheon next on the 30th. I don't say next month. We're in that month now. On the 30th, because we have a very interesting speaker that will discuss kind of what's happening in airport design and et cetera, which he gets into talking about air taxis and stuff. So.
And also, some of the environmental, how any impacts, but big on design and access.
Yeah. Anyway,
Ty.
I'll turn it over to you.
Is his name.
Do you have a date for when the TPB will come to get public input to this update process? Is it?
Not yet. I don't think they've released it yet, but the next CAC meeting is next week, so I can check with them and see. They are going to do a come out and they go around and provide some input, but basically they viewed it. We've released the draft list, and if you want to contact your local legislators and comment on which projects are important, you can go ahead and do that now. So we'll be putting together some things like that to that point as well. I mean, I've been reaching out to Loudoun DOT, Fairfax DOT, Arlington DOT, Prince William DOT, and just saying, hey, what is important to you? What are you focused on keeping? What's dead weight that we can just let go? All those types of things. So, but I don't want to say anything until I've actually had the chance to have those conversations and say, realistically, what are the things that are most impactful?
Scott, Tom Brashadny is leaving Fairfax County in May, but sometime this summer, we need to have a meeting at which we get the heads of the local DOT and the Northern Virginia VDOT office to get, they're going to do the 6-year plan update in probably May, the public hearing. But one of the problems we have is that in submitting projects down to Richmond, we need to have something that reflects that you are in a position to reflect the Dulles area jointly. And I too have seen the fact that the Port of Virginia gets far more attention. I even suggested to Aubrey Lane back in 2012 that the airports be included in the CTB, and nothing happened with that.
You want to close this out? Anyway?
Yes, anyway, let's all, a round of applause for Jason. Thank you, this is great. And also a lot of important stuff to consider with, yeah, not much money is what it basically says.
All right.
There's always more need for money than, than there is money available. And that's just the nature of the beast. So.
Yes.
Senior board doesn't